44 years ago, on a storm-lashed November night in 1981, 12 children from Millbrook Children's Home vanished without a trace after evening prayers, leaving behind only wet footprints in empty corridors. The disappearance of an entire dormitory class plunged their caregivers into inconsolable grief, and the small town of Cedar Falls into bewilderment and fear. Police considered every possibility, from mass abduction to tragic accident, but could never solve the case, causing outrage among the few relatives and community members who refused to let these forgotten children fade into silence. Fighting tirelessly to bring the truth to light, they never lost hope that answers would someday emerge from the darkness that had swallowed 12 innocent souls. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps us bring you more stories like this one. The Millbrook Children's Home stood like a weathered sentinel on Elm Street, its Victorian facade hiding decades of whispered prayers and childhood dreams deferred. Built in 1893 by the widow of a railroad magnate who had lost her own children to scarlet fever, the imposing brick structure had sheltered over 3,000 orphaned children across 9 decades of operation. Its tall windows gazed out over Cedar Falls like watchful eyes, while its maze of corridors and hidden alcoves held the accumulated sorrows and small triumphs of countless young lives seeking belonging in an indifferent world. On that fateful November evening, the first winter storm of the season descended upon Cedar Falls with unusual ferocity. Wind howled through the bare branches of the elm trees that gave the street its name, while sheets of rain hammered against the orphanage's Gothic windows. Inside, the daily routine proceeded with the mechanical precision that had defined institutional life for generations. Dinner was served at 5:30 in the communal dining hall, where 43 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 ate their meals under the watchful supervision of 5 staff members. Sister Catherine Murphy, who had devoted 32 years of her life to caring for Millbrook's children, finished her rounds at 9:30 p.m. precisely, just as she had done every night for over 3 decades. Her final stop was always the second-floor dormitory that housed the 12 youngest children, 7 boys and 5 girls, whose ages spanned from 7 to 14. These were the children who had arrived most recently, still bearing the fresh wounds of abandonment and loss, still needing the extra comfort of bedtime stories and gentle reassurances that tomorrow would bring hope rather than further disappointment. As Sister Catherine moved through the dormitory that night, she noticed nothing unusual beyond the storm's intensity. Sarah Williams, age 7, clutched her threadbare stuffed elephant, a gift from a mother she could barely remember. Tommy Patterson, 10 years old, had arranged his bottle cap collection in perfect rows on his nightstand, a ritual that brought order to a world that had shown him precious little. Maria Santos, the eldest at 14, was reading quietly by lamplight, her dark eyes reflecting a maturity born of responsibilities no child should bear. Michael Thompson, 9, had fallen asleep with his hands folded in prayer position, a habit he had developed after arriving at Millbrook 6 months earlier when his grandmother could no longer care for him. Emma Rodriguez, 8, shared whispered conversations with her imaginary friend, a coping mechanism that concerned the staff, but which they allowed as a source of comfort in her difficult adjustment. David Chen, 11, methodically organized his few possessions each night before sleep, creating small islands of control in an existence defined by institutional schedules and communal living. The other children, Jennifer Walsh, Peter Morrison, Lisa Chen, Robert Hayes, Amanda Foster, and James Patterson, each carried their own stories of loss and resilience. They were bound together not by blood, but by the shared experience of being unwanted by the world beyond Millbrook's walls, yet treasured by the small community of caregivers who had dedicated their lives to providing stability in chaos. Sister Catherine pulled the heavy wooden door closed at exactly 9:35 p.m., the same door that would remain sealed for the next 25 years. She tested the handle as always, ensuring the children's security through the night. The corridor outside was dimly lit by electric sconces that cast long shadows on walls, lined with photographs of former residents, young faces that had grown into adulthood far from Cedar Falls, carrying Millbrook's influence into lives they built despite their difficult beginnings. By morning, the silence was deafening. When Sister Catherine returned with breakfast trays at 6:30 a.m., keys jingling softly as she unlocked the dormitory door, she found 12 neatly made beds and no children. Their nightclothes were folded with military precision at the foot of each bed, their few personal belongings arranged exactly as they had been the night before on wooden nightstands scarred by decades of young hands. The only trace of their existence was a trail of small muddy footprints leading from their beds to the dormitory door. And then nothing. The footprints told a story that made no logical sense. Each child appeared to have gotten up from their bed, removed their nightclothes, dressed in their day clothes, and walked in single file toward the door. The prints were small and distinct. Sarah's tiny size 1 shoes with their characteristic worn heel, Tommy's larger size 4 sneakers, with the distinctive star pattern on the sole that he had pointed out proudly when they arrived second-hand from a church donation. But beyond the dormitory threshold, the trail simply vanished, as if 12 children had stepped from the physical world into some parallel dimension where the laws of physics held no sway. Sister Catherine's scream echoed through Millbrook's corridors at 6:47 a.m., bringing the entire staff running. Dr. James Whitfield, the orphanage director, arrived within minutes, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his hands trembling as he surveyed the impossible scene. The other children were awakened and questioned, but none had heard anything unusual during the night beyond the storm's fury. The older residents searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place where 12 children might conceivably be playing an elaborate prank, but Millbrook's walls held only the echo of their own desperate calls. The local sheriff, Robert Hayes, uncle to one of the missing children, arrived as dawn broke over Cedar Falls, the storm's intensity finally beginning to diminish. A man who had never encountered anything more serious than cattle theft and domestic disputes, he found himself facing the impossible. How does an entire class of children simply vanish from a locked building? The orphanage's heavy doors were still bolted from the inside, their iron hardware showing no signs of tampering. The windows were sealed shut for winter, their old latches rusted in place and painted over years ago. Yet somehow, 12 souls had disappeared into the November storm, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. As dawn revealed the full extent of the night's devastation, the terrible reality began to sink into the collective consciousness of Cedar Falls. The children weren't hiding in the basement or exploring forgotten attics. They were simply gone. Sarah, age 7, with her gap-toothed smile and infinite capacity for hope despite abandonment. Tommy, 10, who dreamed of becoming a pilot and had memorized the names of every aircraft that flew over the orphanage. Maria, 14, who read stories to the younger children every night and served as their unofficial protector and guide. Michael, 9, who collected bottle caps and saw beauty in discarded things that others overlooked. They were all gone, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to echo through the orphanage's empty halls like a prayer without an answer, a question without hope of resolution, a mystery that would haunt Cedar Falls for decades to come and challenge every assumption about the safety of institutional walls and the reliability of adult protection. The FBI descended on Cedar Falls within 48 hours, their black sedans and official badges transforming the quiet town into something resembling a military occupation. Agent Patricia Morrison, a veteran specialist in missing persons cases with 15 years of experience in child abduction investigations, took charge of what would become the most extensive search operation in the region's history. Her team included behavioral analysts, forensic specialists, and search coordinators who had worked similar cases across the country, bringing resources and expertise that the local sheriff's department could never have mustered alone. The initial crime scene analysis revealed disturbing inconsistencies that challenged every conventional theory about what had happened that November night. While the children's footprints led clearly from their beds to the dormitory door, there were no corresponding prints in the main corridor beyond, a physical impossibility that suggested either sophisticated evidence tampering or circumstances that defied logical explanation. The hardwood floors of the corridor showed no signs of recent mopping or cleaning, yet 12 sets of muddy footprints had somehow vanished between one room and the next. The kitchen door, which led to the orphanage's back garden, showed subtle signs of recent use, despite Sister Catherine's absolute certainty that it had been locked and secured immediately after dinner cleanup. Fresh scratches around the lock mechanism suggested tampering, while a thin film of moisture on the interior door handle indicated contact within hours of the discovery. Most puzzling of all, the children's outdoor coats, boots, and warm clothing remained in their assigned cubbies in the main hallway, yet they had somehow ventured into a November storm, wearing only their day clothes and lightweight shoes. Dr. James Whitfield, the orphanage director, became the investigation's first person of interest within hours of the FBI's arrival. A stern man in his early 60s, who ran the institution with military precision and old-fashioned discipline, he claimed to have been in his office doing administrative paperwork until well past midnight on the night of the disappearance. His alibi seemed initially solid. Several staff members reported seeing lights in his office window throughout the evening, but his demeanor during questioning struck investigators as oddly detached, almost rehearsed, as if he had prepared his responses long before being asked. Whitfield's personal history revealed a pattern of administrative positions at various children's institutions across the Midwest, a career trajectory that suggested either dedicated service to child welfare or an unusual willingness to relocate frequently. His references were impeccable, his credentials authentic, yet something in his manner, a calculated precision in his responses, a tendency to deflect rather than directly answer questions, raised red flags among seasoned investigators who had learned to trust their instincts about deception and concealment. The groundskeeper, elderly Martin Cox, provided the investigation's first potentially significant lead when he reluctantly admitted to seeing unusual activity on the night in question. A man in his 70s who had maintained Millbrook's grounds for over 20 years, Cox initially claimed to have seen nothing unusual beyond the storm's intensity. Under gentle but persistent questioning, however, he revealed that he had observed shadows moving near the old chapel ruins around 10 p.m. that night, though he had initially dismissed the sighting as tricks of wind and rain playing against the darkness. The chapel ruins, remnants of a Gothic structure destroyed by fire in 1943, sat on the orphanage grounds like skeletal fingers reaching toward heaven, a reminder of forgotten tragedies and institutional memory stretching back generations. The original chapel had served not only Millbrook, but the broader Cedar Falls community until the devastating fire that had claimed the lives of 3 nuns and a visiting priest. Since then, the ruins had been left untouched, too sacred to demolish yet too dangerous to restore, creating a liminal space where past and present seemed to intersect in unsettling ways. When FBI search teams combed the chapel ruins with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, they discovered evidence of recent human activity that couldn't be explained by casual trespassing or vandalism. Fresh disturbances in the soil near the foundation stones suggested systematic digging, while what appeared to be children's handprints were pressed into the mud around the ruins' perimeter. Most significantly, investigators found fragments of fabric caught on broken stones, fabric that matched the day clothes worn by several of the missing children. The discovery of these physical traces transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a potential homicide inquiry, bringing additional federal resources and intensified media attention. Crime scene photographers documented every inch of the ruins, while forensic specialists collected soil samples and fabric evidence for laboratory analysis. The handprints in the mud were photographed and measured, revealing sizes consistent with the missing children's ages, though the rain and intervening time had degraded the impressions beyond the possibility of individual identification. As weeks turned to months, the case began to fracture under its own weight and complexity. Tips poured in from across the country, sightings of children matching their descriptions in distant cities, theories about cult activity and ritualistic abduction, accusations against current and former staff members who might have had access to the building. Each lead required investigation, each theory demanded resources, yet every promising development ultimately dissolved under scrutiny, leaving investigators with more questions than answers and a growing sense that they were missing some fundamental element that would make the puzzle's pieces fall into place. The media attention that initially brought hope and national awareness slowly transformed into sensational speculation that hindered more than helped the investigation. Tabloid newspapers spun tales of supernatural disappearances and government cover-ups, while television producers arrived in Cedar Falls seeking dramatic interviews and exclusive access to the mystery. The constant attention created additional pressure on investigators, while traumatizing the orphanage's remaining children and staff, who found themselves living under microscopic scrutiny and dealing with reporters who seemed more interested in sensation than resolution. By Christmas of 1981, the active search had been scaled back from intensive daily operations to periodic follow-up investigations and response to new leads. The 12 empty beds in the Millbrook dormitory were stripped of their linens, their mattresses rolled up and stored in the basement, alongside other institutional furniture that nobody wanted to see but couldn't bear to discard. Sister Catherine requested a transfer to another facility in a different state, unable to bear walking past that closed door every day and carrying the weight of unanswered questions about whether she could have done something differently to protect the children in her care. The town of Cedar Falls tried desperately to return to normal daily life, but the specter of those lost children lingered like morning fog that never quite lifts, affecting everything from property values to the willingness of families to trust institutional childcare. Local businesses reported declining tourism, while churches struggled with congregations asking difficult questions about divine protection and the problem of evil. The Millbrook case had become more than a criminal investigation. It was a test of faith, community identity, and the fundamental assumptions that people make about safety and security in their daily lives. As 1982 dawned cold and grey over Cedar Falls, the official investigation into the Millbrook disappearances had effectively stalled despite the FBI's continued presence and periodic renewed efforts. The case lived on, however, in hushed conversations at coffee shops and church gatherings, in late-night theories shared among insomniacs who couldn't stop thinking about 12 empty beds, and in the persistent questions of family members who refused to accept that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved. Former staff members, initially reluctant to speak critically about their workplace and colleagues, began sharing stories they had kept to themselves during the intense early phase of the investigation. These revelations emerged slowly, often accidentally, in conversations that started about other topics before drifting inevitably toward the events of that November night. Margaret Thompson, who had worked as head cook at Millbrook for 15 years, was among the first to break the informal code of institutional silence that had initially protected the orphanage's reputation. Thompson revealed that several children in the younger dormitory had complained of recurring nightmares and sleep disturbances in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. The dreams, as described by children ranging from 7 to 14 years old, shared disturbing common elements that suggested either shared trauma or coordinated influence. Multiple children spoke of a tall man who appeared in their dreams, someone who promised them escape from institutional life and transport to a better place where special children like you can reach your full potential. The children's accounts, when Thompson finally shared them with investigators, painted a picture of systematic psychological preparation that suggested planning extending far beyond a single night's opportunity. The mysterious dream figure allegedly told the children that their departure would need to be secret, that they couldn't tell anyone about the wonderful new life awaiting them, and that they would need to trust him completely when the time came for their journey to begin. Most unnervingly, several children had apparently begun looking forward to this promised escape, seeing it as rescue rather than abduction. When Thompson had initially reported these concerns to Dr. Whitfield in October 1981, expressing worry about the children's mental state and the consistency of their disturbing dreams, he had dismissed her observations as typical childhood fears amplified by institutional living conditions. He instructed her specifically not to spread unnecessary panic among the staff and suggested that too much attention to the children's nightmares might actually reinforce their fears and create additional psychological problems. His response, Thompson now realized, had been calculated to prevent exactly the kind of investigation that might have uncovered his involvement. The most unsettling revelation came from Father Benedict Morris, the soft-spoken chaplain who had conducted evening prayers at Millbrook for over a decade. A man whose gentle demeanor and genuine care for the children had made him beloved among residents and staff alike, Father Morris had initially hesitated to share his concerns about Dr. Whitfield's behavior on the night of the disappearance. His respect for institutional hierarchy and his natural tendency to assume positive motives had initially prevented him from speaking about observations that, in retrospect, seemed deeply significant. Father Morris admitted that Dr. Whitfield had seemed unusually agitated during evening prayers on November 13th, asking pointed questions about the younger children's sleeping arrangements, their family connections, and whether any of them had relatives who might be expected to visit or inquire about their welfare. The director's questions had seemed oddly specific and urgent, focusing particularly on children who had arrived recently and had minimal outside contact. When Father Morris gently pressed him about his apparent concerns, Whitfield had replied cryptically that some problems require permanent solutions and that not all children are suited for traditional institutional care. The chaplain's testimony provided investigators with their first clear indication that the disappearance had been premeditated rather than opportunistic, suggesting planning that extended back at least several weeks before the actual event. Whitfield's questions about family connections implied careful selection of victims who would be missed least, while his interest in sleeping arrangements suggested advanced planning for accessing the dormitory without detection. Most damning was his comment about permanent solutions, which could be interpreted as evidence of intent to ensure the children would never return to raise questions about their treatment. Local journalist Rebecca Stone, who had covered the Millbrook story from its first day and had developed sources throughout the community, began uncovering a disturbing pattern in her independent research into the orphanage's recent history. Working with limited resources but unlimited determination, Stone had spent months reviewing institutional records, tracking down former employees, and investigating the fate of children who had supposedly left Millbrook for other placements in the years preceding the mass disappearance. Stone's investigation revealed that Millbrook had reported an unusually high number of transfers and adoptions over the 5 years from 1976 to 1981, children who had supposedly been moved to other facilities or placed with adoptive families, but whose paperwork seemed suspiciously sparse and whose destinations were difficult to verify. When she attempted to trace these children through normal channels, she encountered a pattern of dead ends, disconnected phone numbers, and forwarding addresses that led to vacant lots or non-existent buildings. The numbers were striking when viewed in aggregate. 47 children had allegedly left Millbrook for better placements during Whitfield's 5-year tenure, compared to an average of 12 per year during the previous decade under different administration. The paperwork for these transfers, while technically complete, lacked the detailed coordination and follow-up documentation that typically accompanied legitimate institutional transfers. Most concerning was the absence of any subsequent contact from these children or their new guardians, a departure from the tradition of occasional letters and holiday cards that had connected former residents to their institutional home. Stone's attempts to interest federal investigators in these historical patterns met with limited success initially. Agent Morrison, overwhelmed with active leads and fresh evidence from the November disappearance, treated the journalist's findings as potentially relevant background information rather than central evidence. The FBI's position remained focused on the immediate case. 12 children had vanished on a specific night, and their investigation needed to concentrate on that event rather than potentially unrelated institutional issues from previous years. However, some individuals refused to dismiss Stone's research as mere coincidence or journalistic sensationalism. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the sheriff's widow, had maintained her own unofficial investigation into her nephew's disappearance with the methodical persistence of someone who had learned detective techniques through decades of marriage to a law enforcement officer. Her dining room had become an informal command center, filled with newspaper clippings, photocopied FBI reports her husband had managed to obtain before his death, and hand-drawn timelines that attempted to make sense of contradictory evidence and unanswered questions. Mrs. Hayes's wall of photographs, documents, and handwritten notes created a visual representation of the case's complexity while serving as a shrine to the 12 missing children, a testament to the belief that truth, however deeply buried beneath institutional secrecy and bureaucratic inertia, possesses its own persistent energy that eventually surfaces when circumstances align properly. Her detailed files included not only information about the November 1981 disappearance, but also Stone's research into previous suspicious transfers, creating a comprehensive picture that suggested systematic criminal activity rather than a single tragic event. The unofficial investigation maintained by Mrs. Hayes and supported by Stone's journalistic work began attracting attention from other family members and community residents who had their own suspicions about Millbrook's operations during the Whitfield years. Former employees came forward with additional concerns they had been afraid to voice during the official investigation, while parents and relatives of children who had supposedly been transferred to better situations began asking uncomfortable questions about why they had never heard from their young family members again. This grassroots network of concerned citizens created an alternative information source that operated parallel to, but largely separate from the official FBI investigation. Their informal coordination and persistent questions kept the Millbrook case alive in public consciousness when institutional attention began to wane, ensuring that the search for answers would continue even when federal resources were inevitably redirected to newer cases and more pressing concerns. In small-town America, where everyone knows everyone else's business and family connections extend across generations, the power of collective memory and stubborn determination often proves more durable than official investigations constrained by bureaucratic limitations and jurisdictional boundaries. 20 years had passed since that stormy November night, and Cedar Falls had learned to live with its ghosts in the way that small communities adapt to tragedies too large for complete healing. The town's rhythm had gradually absorbed the weight of unanswered questions, incorporating the mystery of the Millbrook 12 into its collective identity like a scar that becomes part of the body's landscape, always present, occasionally painful, but no longer dominating every aspect of daily existence. The Millbrook Children's Home had closed its doors permanently in 1987, 6 years after the disappearance that had shattered its reputation and made it impossible to attract either funding or families willing to trust their most vulnerable children to institutional care. The Victorian building stood empty on Elm Street, its boarded windows and overgrown gardens creating an atmosphere of abandonment that seemed to mirror the fate of the children it had once sheltered. Ivy crept up its weathered brick facade, like nature's attempt to heal what humanity had broken, while local teenagers dared each other to approach the building on Halloween, transforming tragedy into legend through the alchemy of time and adolescent bravado. By 2001, most of the key figures in the original investigation had died or moved away, taking their first-hand knowledge and professional insights with them into retirement or the grave. Dr. Whitfield had passed away in 1994 from complications related to diabetes, taking whatever secrets he harbored to his final resting place in Cedar Falls Cemetery, ironically, less than 100 yards from where some of his former charges had once played in the orphanage's backyard. His death had been noted in the local newspaper with a brief, factual obituary that mentioned his years of service to child welfare without any reference to the cloud of suspicion that had hung over his final years. Agent Patricia Morrison had retired to a small house in Florida in 1998. Her final report on the Millbrook case representing a masterpiece of bureaucratic frustration, hundreds of pages documenting leads that went nowhere, evidence that proved nothing conclusive, and theories that couldn't withstand rigorous scrutiny. Her retirement files contained personal notes expressing her conviction that the children had been murdered and their bodies concealed somewhere within a 50-mile radius of Cedar Falls, but without concrete evidence to support continued investigation, the case had been officially classified as cold and transferred to the state police's Unsolved Crimes Division. The 12 missing children existed now primarily in faded newspaper archives and the stubborn memory of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, who continued her solitary vigil despite her advancing age and declining health. Her dining room shrine had become both more elaborate and more poignant over the years, incorporating new clippings about similar cases from around the country, updated photographs of the children showing what they might look like as adults, and handwritten letters to various law enforcement agencies requesting renewed attention to the case that had defined her widowhood. The new generation of Cedar Falls residents knew the Millbrook story as local legend rather than lived trauma, the kind of cautionary tale that parents use to keep children from wandering too far from home after dark, and that added an element of delicious fear to sleepovers and summer camp ghost stories. The details had become fluid over time, subject to embellishment and creative interpretation that gradually transformed documented facts into folklore. Some versions of the story claimed the children had been taken by a satanic cult. Others suggested government experiments or alien abduction, while the most persistent variant insisted that the orphanage itself was built on cursed ground where Native American children had died during the forced relocations of the 19th century. Real estate agents had learned to avoid showing properties on Elm Street to newcomers, without first providing what they euphemistically called proper contextualization of the neighborhood's history. The Millbrook building and its immediate surroundings had become effectively unmarketable, their property values depressed by a combination of genuine superstition and practical concerns about living next to a site associated with unsolved tragedy. Several attempts to demolish the building and redevelop the land had been blocked by a combination of historical preservation advocates, family members who still hoped for answers, and city council members who feared that destruction of the building might eliminate evidence that could eventually solve the case. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic anthropologist completing her doctoral studies at the State University, first encountered the Millbrook case while researching historical missing persons patterns for her dissertation on institutional failures in child protection systems. Her academic interest was initially purely professional. Cold cases involving children were tragically common in American history, and the Millbrook disappearance represented an interesting example of how institutional authority could be exploited to conceal criminal activity from oversight and accountability. What transformed Chen's scholarly interest into personal obsession was a discovery that emerged during her genealogical research into her own family history. While reviewing immigration records and census data for her dissertation's background research, she uncovered documentation revealing that Tommy Patterson, one of the missing Millbrook children, had been her cousin, the son of her grandfather's brother, a family connection that had been hidden by decades of silence and deliberate forgetting. Her grandfather, she learned, had never spoken of his nephew's fate because the pain was too great and the questions too terrible to contemplate repeatedly. This revelation transformed abstract academic research into a quest for family truth and personal closure, driving Chen to spend weekends in Cedar Falls, walking the orphanage grounds, studying architectural blueprints at the town hall, and interviewing elderly residents who remembered the original investigation. Her scientific training provided her with analytical tools that previous investigators had lacked, while her personal investment gave her the motivation to pursue questions that others had abandoned as unanswerable or irrelevant. Chen's background in forensic anthropology also gave her a unique perspective on the physical evidence that had been collected but never fully analyzed during the original investigation. She recognized that advances in DNA analysis, soil chemistry, and archaeological techniques over the past 20 years had created opportunities to re-examine evidence that had been inconclusive or meaningless in 1981. Her academic connections provided access to laboratory facilities and expert consultants who might be willing to donate their services to a case that had captured public imagination and offered opportunities for scientific advancement. The breakthrough that would eventually crack the case came from Chen's architectural analysis of the Millbrook building itself, an approach that previous investigators had never systematically pursued. While reviewing original construction blueprints from 1893 and comparing them to renovation records from subsequent decades, she discovered significant discrepancies that suggested the building contained spaces that weren't reflected in official floor plans or institutional memory. Her training in archaeological site analysis allowed her to recognize patterns in the architectural modifications that pointed toward deliberate concealment rather than routine maintenance or modernization. Most significantly, Chen discovered that the Millbrook building had undergone extensive renovations in 1979, just 2 years before the disappearances, modifications that had been overseen by Dr. Whitfield personally and completed by contractors from outside the local area. The renovation records, buried in municipal files and never previously connected to the missing children case, documented what was officially described as energy efficiency improvements and space optimization for modern institutional needs. However, Chen's analysis of the contractor's detailed notes revealed references to sealing off unused spaces in the upper floors and creating secure storage areas for institutional records and seasonal materials. For the first time in 2 decades, someone was asking the right questions about what might be physically hidden within the Victorian walls of the abandoned Millbrook Children's Home. Chen's architectural detective work suggested that the building itself might contain the key to understanding what had happened on that November night, not just evidence of the crime, but potentially the crime scene itself, preserved in sealed spaces that had been waiting 20 years for someone with the right combination of knowledge, access, and determination to unlock their secrets. Her findings represented a paradigm shift in thinking about the case. moving from theories about external abduction to possibilities of internal concealment, from assumptions about transportation to considerations of architectural manipulation. If Chen's analysis was correct, the 12 children of Millbrook might never have left the building at all. They might be waiting in some form within the walls that had once protected them and might now serve as their tomb and memorial. Sarah Chen's discovery of the 1979 renovations opened a door that had been sealed by more than just bureaucracy and time. It revealed a methodical plan that had been hiding in plain sight for over 2 decades, documented in municipal files that no one had thought to examine because the crime was assumed to have occurred outside the building rather than within its modified walls. Armed with the contractor's original blueprints, detailed renovation notes, and a team of graduate students eager to apply cutting-edge archaeological techniques to a case that had captured national attention, Chen returned to Cedar Falls in the spring of 2003 with equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators who had worked the case in 1981. The ground-penetrating radar scans revealed structural anomalies throughout the orphanage's upper floors that painted a picture of systematic architectural manipulation designed to create hidden spaces within the building's existing framework. The technology, originally developed for military applications and adapted for archaeological surveys, could detect density variations in walls, floors, and ceilings that indicated hollow spaces, filled areas, or structural modifications that differed from the original construction materials. What the scans showed was not random renovation work, but a carefully planned reconfiguration of internal spaces that created rooms and corridors invisible to casual observation. Behind what appeared to be solid walls throughout the second and third floors, entire chambers waited in darkness, their contents preserved like artifacts in a pharaoh's tomb. The radar signatures suggested that these concealed spaces contained furniture, personal belongings, and other materials consistent with active human habitation, rather than simple storage or mechanical equipment. Most intriguingly, the scans revealed a complex network of hidden passages connecting these secret rooms to each other and to points of entry and exit that bypassed the building's known circulation patterns. The most significant anomaly was located directly above the second-floor dormitory, where the 12 children had slept, a space that, according to the building's official floor plans, should have been empty attic storage, but registered on radar as a fully furnished room approximately the same size and configuration as the dormitory below. The radar signature showed what appeared to be beds, furniture, and other objects arranged in patterns that mirrored the layout of the children's sleeping quarters, suggesting either a duplicate facility or a staging area designed to replicate familiar surroundings. Chen's findings attracted the immediate attention of Detective Marcus Webb, who had been appointed as the new head of Cedar Falls Police Department following his predecessor's retirement. Unlike the previous generation of local law enforcement, Webb had no personal investment in protecting the original investigation's reputation or maintaining institutional relationships that might complicate a renewed inquiry. He saw the cold case as an opportunity to demonstrate modern forensic capabilities, while potentially bringing closure to a community that had carried its burden of unanswered questions for over 2 decades. Webb's background included specialized training in cold case investigation techniques and experience with cases involving institutional abuse and cover-ups. He recognized that the Millbrook disappearance exhibited patterns consistent with crimes committed by individuals in positions of authority who used their institutional access and community trust to facilitate and conceal criminal activity. His approach emphasized physical evidence and scientific analysis over witness testimony and circumstantial theories, understanding that after 22 years, memory and motivation could be unreliable while physical traces remained constant. The legal process to gain entry to the abandoned building required 6 months of paperwork, court hearings, and negotiations with multiple parties who had various claims on the property and its contents. The orphanage's former board of directors, now scattered across the country, and represented by lawyers who seemed more concerned with liability issues than historical truth, fought the search request through every available legal channel. Their attorneys cited concerns about structural safety, environmental contamination, and what they termed disruption to community healing processes that have allowed Cedar Falls to move beyond this tragedy. The opposition to the search seemed disproportionate to any reasonable concerns about building safety or legal liability, suggesting that some parties still had interests in keeping the building's secrets buried. Court documents revealed that several former board members had gone on to prominent positions in child welfare organizations and political offices, careers that could be significantly damaged by revelations about their oversight failures during the Whitfield years. The legal battle became a contest between institutional self-protection and the pursuit of truth, with the families of the missing children caught in the middle of procedural delays and bureaucratic stonewalling. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, now in her 80s but still sharp as winter wind, provided crucial testimony during the court proceedings about her right to know what had happened to her nephew and the other children whose disappearance had defined her husband's final years in law enforcement. Her appearance in court, supported by a walker but speaking with the clear voice of moral authority, represented not just personal loss, but the community's collective need for resolution. Her testimony about the decades of unanswered questions and the failure of official investigations to provide closure for the families helped convince the judge that the potential benefits of the search outweighed the procedural obstacles raised by the building's former administrators. On October 15, 2003, a construction crew arrived at the Millbrook Children's Home with sledgehammers, metal detectors, and industrial equipment designed to safely breach walls that had been sealed for nearly a quarter-century. Sarah Chen stood beside Detective Webb as they prepared to unlock spaces that had been deliberately hidden from the world, understanding that they were about to disturb not just architectural elements, but potentially criminal evidence that had been preserved in darkness since the Reagan administration. The first swing of the hammer against the third-floor wall sent a sound echoing through the empty building that seemed to awaken ghosts that had been waiting patiently for this moment of revelation. The impact produced a hollow boom that confirmed the radar findings. Significant empty space lay behind the false wall, space that had been breathing quietly in the darkness while Cedar Falls tried unsuccessfully to forget the children who had vanished on that November night over 2 decades earlier. What emerged from that first breach was a rush of stale air that carried scents of old wood, dust, and something else, something organic and troubling that made the construction foreman step back and request industrial ventilation equipment before they proceeded further. The air that escaped from the hidden chamber had been trapped since 1981, carrying with it microscopic traces of whatever had occurred in those concealed spaces during the months and years following the children's disappearance. Chemical analysis would later reveal the presence of cleaning compounds, disinfectants, and other materials consistent with extensive efforts to sanitize and preserve the hidden rooms while eliminating evidence of their original use. Behind the false wall lay a narrow corridor that led to rooms the outside world had forgotten, spaces where time itself seemed to have stopped on that November night in 1981. The corridor's walls were lined with photographs, images of the 12 missing children engaged in daily activities, apparently taken during their time at Millbrook, but never seen by investigators or family members. The photographs suggested systematic documentation of the children's lives and behavior patterns, the kind of detailed observation that might be used for research purposes or to demonstrate their well-being to interested parties. As the investigation team prepared to explore the full extent of the hidden spaces, they understood that they were crossing a threshold that would either provide answers to questions that had haunted Cedar Falls for over 20 years, or raise new and more disturbing questions about the true nature of the crimes committed within the Millbrook Children's Home. The building that had once represented safety and protection for orphaned children was revealing itself to be something far more sinister, a carefully designed facility for activities that had been hidden not just from law enforcement, but from the basic human decency that was supposed to govern institutions dedicated to child welfare. The discovery that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives occurred on October 17, 2003, when the construction team finally breached the wall directly above the original second-floor dormitory where the 12 children had spent their final night at Millbrook. Detective Webb's industrial flashlight cut through 22 years of absolute darkness to illuminate a scene that defied not just comprehension, but the basic assumptions everyone had made about the nature of the crime they were investigating. The hidden room was a perfect mirror of the dormitory below, complete with 12 small beds arranged in identical rows, each topped with a pillow and folded blanket that appeared to have been placed with the same institutional precision that had characterized life at Millbrook during its years of operation. The beds themselves were antiques, matching the Victorian-era furniture that had been used throughout the orphanage, suggesting that this duplicate dormitory had been created using materials from the building's original construction or from institutional surplus that had been systematically collected over time. Sarah Chen's voice caught in her throat as she began documenting the scene, her archaeological training warring with her emotional response to seeing a space that had been designed to replicate the environment where her cousin Tommy had spent his final night before vanishing into whatever fate had awaited him in this hidden chamber. Unlike the stripped dormitory below, this concealed room remained exactly as it had been left on that November night over 2 decades earlier, preserved in darkness like a museum display of institutional childhood interrupted by unspeakable events. 12 sets of children's clothes lay folded on 12 wooden chairs positioned beside each bed, the garments arranged with the kind of compulsive neatness that suggested either institutional routine or psychological compulsion. The clothing appeared to be the day clothes the children had been wearing when they disappeared, removed and folded, as if in preparation for sleep or for activities that required different attire. The fabric showed signs of having been cleaned and pressed, suggesting that someone had taken care to maintain the appearance of order and normalcy even within this hidden chamber of horrors. Personal belongings that had been reported missing from the children's official quarters sat undisturbed on bedside tables throughout the secret dormitory. Maria's diary with its broken lock, Tommy's carefully organized bottle cap collection, Sarah's threadbare stuffed elephant that had been her only connection to a mother she barely remembered. The presence of these intimate objects confirmed that the children had been in this room, that their disappearance from the official dormitory had led not to freedom or death, but to imprisonment in a space designed to replicate their previous living environment while keeping them completely isolated from the outside world. Most unnervingly, wet footprints were still visible in the dust that had accumulated on the wooden floor over more than 20 years of abandonment. The preservation of these traces seemed impossible, given the building's exposure to temperature variations and humidity changes, yet laboratory analysis would later confirm that the impressions contained DNA traces consistent with the missing children and chemical residues from cleaning products that had been used to maintain the room's environment long after its official abandonment. The footprint patterns told a story of movement throughout the hidden dormitory that suggested the children had lived in this space for an extended period, rather than simply passing through during a single night of terror. Multiple overlapping tracks led from the beds to areas of the room that contained evidence of daily activities, a corner where books and educational materials had been arranged, another area where art supplies suggested creative activities had taken place, and most heartbreakingly, a section near the room's single window where the children appeared to have gathered regularly, perhaps hoping to see the outside world they had been forbidden to contact. The forensics team worked in reverent silence, photographing every detail before disturbing anything in the room that had become both crime scene and memorial. Dr. Elizabeth Murray, the state's chief medical examiner, supervised the collection of organic material found on several of the beds, dark stains that suggested the children had remained in this room not for hours, but for weeks or months, possibly suffering from illness or injury that had required medical attention that was either inadequate or deliberately withheld. Carbon dating and chemical analysis of the stains would later confirm that they originated from 1981 and contained biological markers consistent with stress, malnutrition, and medical conditions that suggested systematic neglect or abuse. The evidence painted a picture of children who had been kept alive in the hidden dormitory, but under conditions that gradually deteriorated their health and psychological well-being, transforming their imprisonment from temporary isolation into a slow process of institutional murder disguised as care. Detective Webb found the room's most disturbing feature near the single window that provided the chamber's only natural light, a wooden desk covered with papers in Dr. Whitfield's distinctive handwriting. The documents, preserved in a manila folder tied with string, detailed what he had labeled Project Haven, described as a comprehensive plan to relocate select children to environments more suitable for their unique developmental needs and potential contributions to specialized research initiatives. The Project Haven documents revealed a level of planning and coordination that extended far beyond the boundaries of Cedar Falls or even the state of Iowa. Whitfield's papers referenced payments from multiple unnamed benefactors, transportation arrangements to facilities in West Virginia and Montana, and coordination with individuals identified only by code names who appeared to represent a network of institutions and private individuals interested in acquiring children for purposes that were never explicitly stated, but clearly involved activities that required absolute secrecy and isolation from oversight. Among Whitfield's papers was a letter dated November 14, 1981, the day after the disappearance, addressed to someone identified only as the patron. In his careful, precise handwriting, Whitfield reported that the 12 subjects have been successfully prepared for transfer as agreed upon in our previous correspondence, and that the facility's staff remains completely unaware of the true nature of their departure or the arrangements that have been made for their continued care and development. The letter continued with references to immediate payment of the agreed-upon sum and assurances that no further contact would be necessary between our institutions as the subjects' integration into their new environment should proceed according to the protocols we have established over the past 3 years of collaboration. Most chillingly, Whitfield concluded by noting that the success of this operation demonstrates the viability of expanding our cooperation to include additional subjects who meet the established criteria for specialized placement. The hidden staircase that the team discovered in the room's far corner provided the final piece of the architectural puzzle that had enabled Dr. Whitfield to make 12 children vanish without leaving any trace in the building's known circulation patterns. The stairway, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall, descended through the building's interior structure to emerge in the basement behind a false wall in what had once been the coal storage room. The passage explained not only how the children could disappear from a locked building, but also how they could be transported to and from the hidden dormitory without being seen by staff members or other residents. The discovery of the secret dormitory and its contents transformed the Millbrook case from a missing persons investigation into something far more sinister, evidence of systematic trafficking of institutionalized children by individuals who used their positions of authority and community trust to facilitate crimes that defied the basic moral assumptions upon which civilized society depends. The 12 children had not been murdered quickly or transported immediately. The discovery of Dr. Whitfield's documents transformed a cold case into an active federal investigation within hours. FBI agent Jennifer Martinez, a specialist in human trafficking crimes, arrived in Cedar Falls with a task force that brought resources the 1981 investigation had never possessed. The revelation that the Millbrook disappearances connected to a larger trafficking network gave new urgency to finding not just answers, but potentially living survivors. The letter to the patron became their most crucial evidence. Forensic analysis confirmed Whitfield's handwriting and revealed traces of expensive Swiss fountain pen ink, far beyond an orphanage director's typical budget. More importantly, the letter's reference to West Virginia provided the first concrete geographical lead in over 20 years, pointing investigators toward a region known for isolated facilities operating beyond state oversight. Agent Martinez's financial investigation uncovered systematic corruption extending far beyond Cedar Falls. Bank records showed Whitfield had received regular payments from Thornfield Enterprises, a Delaware shell company, dating back to 1978. The amounts were substantial, $50,000 per placement, suggesting multiple children had been sold over several years. The payments coincided perfectly with the suspicious transfers that journalist Rebecca Stone had documented, creating a paper trail of systematic child trafficking disguised as legitimate adoptions. The breakthrough came when investigators traced Thornfield Enterprises to its ultimate owner, Marcus Thornfield, a wealthy industrialist who had died in 1988. His sealed estate records revealed extensive properties in rural West Virginia, including a remote facility euphemistically described as a private educational institution for exceptional children. The facility, known as Thornfield Academy, had operated without state oversight from 1978 until its owner's death, housing up to 50 children in dormitory-style buildings surrounded by high walls and electronic surveillance. Property records showed the academy had been shuttered immediately after Thornfield's death, its buildings abandoned and records destroyed according to instructions in his will. The facility's isolation, accessible only by a single mountain road through dense forest, explained why it had remained hidden for so long. Satellite images revealed building foundations and road networks consistent with a substantial institutional complex designed for maximum privacy and minimum outside contact. The most promising lead came from Helen Rodriguez, a former Thornfield Academy cook now living in Arizona. Rodriguez remembered the arrival of a group of children in late 1981 who seemed different from the others, scared and confused, like they didn't belong. These children were kept separate from regular residents and staff were instructed not to interact with them or learn their names. Her testimony provided the first eyewitness account, confirming that the Millbrook 12 had survived their transfer from Cedar Falls. Rodriguez had kept copies of meal planning documents and staff schedules that might help identify which children had been at the facility during the critical period. Her meticulous records as head cook included daily counts that showed exactly 12 additional residents from November 1981 through spring 1984, a timeline that perfectly matched the Millbrook disappearance and suggested the children had survived their initial captivity for several years. As the investigation expanded, Agent Martinez coordinated with law enforcement agencies across multiple states to identify other facilities connected to the Thornfield network. The pattern emerging was of wealthy individuals using shell companies to purchase children from corrupted institutional administrators, creating a supply chain of human trafficking that exploited the most vulnerable members of society while hiding behind legitimate facades of charitable child welfare work. Helen Rodriguez's documents proved invaluable when FBI teams excavated the abandoned Thornfield Academy site in March 2004. Her meal records, staff schedules, and facility layouts guided investigators to key areas where evidence might have survived decades of deliberate abandonment. The mountain facility, though weathered by neglect, had remained structurally intact, preserving spaces that contained the final chapters of the Millbrook children's story. In the Academy's administrative building, investigators discovered a hidden safe containing financial records, correspondence, and most crucially, photographs of children who had lived at the facility. Among these images were school-style portraits of 12 children whose faces matched the Millbrook missing persons files, proof that they had survived the transfer from Cedar Falls and lived at Thornfield Academy for several years under conditions that remained to be determined. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the original FBI agent who had investigated the disappearances, came out of retirement to assist with the Thornfield excavation. Now 73 but driven by a career-defining need for closure, she brought decades of experience to coordinate the systematic search of buildings and grounds where the children's ultimate fate would finally be revealed. The breakthrough came in the Academy's former library, where investigators found journals and artwork created by the children during their captivity. The handwritten accounts documented lives of isolation, fear, and psychological manipulation disguised as education. One journal, confirmed through handwriting analysis as Tommy Patterson's, contained detailed descriptions of the other Millbrook children and their struggle to understand their situation. The journals revealed that children were periodically graduated to other locations as they aged, while younger ones remained for additional preparation. Tommy's final entry, dated March 1984, described his fear about an upcoming placement ceremony and his desperate hope that someday someone will remember us and come looking. His words provided heartbreaking insight into the children's awareness of their abandonment and their enduring hope for rescue. The investigation's most emotional discovery was a makeshift memorial the children had created in a small room adjacent to the library. Using secretly gathered materials, they had built a shrine to their memories of Millbrook, complete with drawings of Sister Catherine, the orphanage, and each other. At the center was a hand-drawn map of Cedar Falls marked with the words, "Don't forget us," in Tommy's careful script, a message that had waited 23 years for someone to find and understand. Forensic excavation of the Academy grounds revealed burial sites containing the remains of 4 children who had died during their captivity between 1982 and 1984. DNA analysis confirmed that Tommy Patterson was among those who had not survived their imprisonment, along with 3 other Millbrook children who had succumbed to medical neglect and the psychological trauma of prolonged captivity. The Thornfield Academy investigation ultimately revealed the fate of all 12 missing children, though the truth proved more complex than anyone had imagined. Through surviving records, testimony from former staff, and DNA analysis, investigators determined that 8 children had survived their captivity and been systematically placed with wealthy families across the country, sold as adoptees to couples who either didn't question or didn't care about their origins. The most remarkable breakthrough came when Agent Martinez located Maria Santos, now 38, and living in Oregon under the name Maria Whitmore. She had been adopted at 16 by a family who believed they were helping a troubled teen from a failed educational program. Maria's memories had been suppressed through trauma and psychological manipulation, but seeing photographs of her dormitory mates triggered recovered memories that provided crucial testimony about their shared ordeal. Through Maria's account and partial academy records, investigators traced 6 other survivors to locations across the United States. Each had been placed with families who paid substantial fees for discreet adoptions without asking questions about backgrounds. Most heartbreakingly, several survivors had spent decades believing themselves alone, unaware that others had shared their experience or that anyone was searching for them. The investigation revealed that Tommy Patterson and 3 others had died at Thornfield Academy between 1982 and 1984, victims of medical experiments that Marcus Thornfield had justified as advancement research. Their remains were finally recovered from the mountain facility, allowing families to provide proper burials after 23 years of uncertainty and hope. Sarah Chen's reunion with her cousin Maria became a symbol of persistence, rewarded with truth. Standing together at Tommy Patterson's funeral, finally laid to rest beside his parents, they represented both the cost of institutional failure and the power of determination to eventually bring justice to light. Mrs. Hayes, now 85 and frail but still sharp, attended every service and reunion, her lifetime of dedication finally rewarded with answers to questions that had defined her widowhood. The Millbrook case led to federal legislation requiring enhanced oversight of private children's facilities and strengthened interstate adoption protocols. Dr. Whitfield and Marcus Thornfield had exploited gaps in regulation and communication between agencies, weaknesses that their crimes helped identify and eventually address through comprehensive child protection reforms. In 2006, the abandoned Millbrook Children's Home was demolished, its Victorian walls finally released from the burden of their secrets. Cedar Falls built a memorial park on the site, featuring a bronze plaque listing 12 names with the inscription, "Lost but not forgotten." Their voices called us to seek truth, and truth brought them home. Today, 5 Millbrook survivors maintain contact, creating family bonds that trauma interrupted but couldn't destroy. Their annual gathering in Cedar Falls serves as both memorial and celebration, honoring those lost while affirming the resilience of those who survived. Maria Santos frequently speaks to law enforcement groups about the importance of never abandoning cold cases, reminding investigators that every missing child represents a family still hoping for answers. The Millbrook story reminds us that the most profound mysteries are often hidden not by supernatural forces, but by human failure. The failure to protect the vulnerable, to ask difficult questions, and to persist when institutions prefer silence to justice. In the end, it wasn't advanced technology or brilliant deduction that solved the case, but the simple refusal of ordinary people to accept that some truths are too painful to uncover. The children's voices, silenced for over 20 years, had finally been heard. Their story became a testament to the power of memory, the importance of never giving up hope, and the truth that love, whether from family, community, or strangers who refuse to forget, can transcend even the darkest attempts to erase human dignity and worth. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of the Millbrook 12. We'll see you in the next video.